In the heart of Chicago, the fall air conceals the heartbeat of a man on the brink of redemption or despair. Michael Reeves stands outside an upscale restaurant, poised to confront the ghosts of a life fractured by divorce and time. Unbeknownst to him, inside waits not only his estranged daughter, but the woman whose absence is a constant ache, Catherine. Faced with more than he bargained for, Michael teeters on the edge of a night that could either heal or break him anew. Stay with us if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. The autumn air bit at Michael Reeves's exposed skin as he stood outside the upscale restaurant, his fingers fumbling with the collar of his jacket, a nervous habit he developed in his late 40s. At 54, the lines on his face had deepened, carved by nearly 2 decades of solitude and the quiet desperation of a man who had lost everything that once defined him. The restaurant's warm lights spilled onto the Chicago sidewalk, illuminating the passing faces of strangers who would never know how much courage it had taken for him to be standing there. Inside waited his daughter, Emma, now 28, celebrating her promotion at the architectural firm where she'd been working since graduating. The invitation had come 3 days ago, a text message that had caused his hands to tremble so violently he'd nearly dropped his phone. They hadn't spoken in person for almost 7 years. Their relationship had been a casualty of his divorce from Catherine, a slow-bleeding wound that never properly healed. "You can do this," he whispered to himself, the words dissolving into vapor in the cold air. The host smiled as he approached, a practiced expression that revealed nothing about the pathetic sight he must have presented. A middle-aged man in a sport coat that had gone out of style years ago, looking like he might flee at any moment. "Reservation name?" the young man asked. "Reeves. Emma Reeves," Michael replied, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. The host nodded. "Yes, sir. Most of the party has already arrived. Please follow me." Most of the party. The words echoed in Michael's mind as he followed the host through the restaurant. Emma hadn't mentioned others would be joining them. He'd prepared himself mentally for just her, rehearsed what he might say after years of stilted phone calls and perfunctory holiday greetings. The anxiety that had been simmering beneath his skin began to boil. Then he saw her. Catherine sat at a large round table near the back of the restaurant, her head thrown back in laughter at something someone had said. At 52, she was still beautiful, more beautiful perhaps than when they divorced 19 years ago. Her dark hair, now streaked with elegant strands of silver, was cut in a stylish bob that framed her face perfectly. She wore a deep blue dress that complemented her eyes, those same piercing blue eyes that had once looked at him with love, then with disappointment, and finally with nothing at all. Michael froze mid-step, causing a waiter to nearly collide with him. He mumbled an apology without taking his eyes off the table. Catherine wasn't alone with Emma. There were 5 other people with her, 4 young adults who appeared to be in their early to mid-20s, and a man about Michael's age whom he didn't recognize. The host turned, noticing Michael had stopped. "Sir, your party is just there." Michael nodded mechanically and continued forward, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force he was certain everyone in the restaurant could hear it. Emma spotted him first, her face lighting up in a way he hadn't seen in years. She rose from her chair, moving toward him with her arms outstretched. "Dad, you made it!" she exclaimed, embracing him tightly. He returned the hug, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, something floral and unfamiliar. When had she stopped using the lavender shampoo she'd loved since high school? Another detail lost to time and distance. "Of course I did," he managed, his voice steadier than he felt. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." As Emma pulled away, Michael's eyes drifted back to Catherine. She was watching them, her expression unreadable. When their eyes met, she offered a small, tight smile, the kind reserved for casual acquaintances or people you'd rather not see. "Mom's here," Emma said, following his gaze. "And Robert." She gestured to the man sitting beside Catherine, who gave a cordial nod in Michael's direction. "I hope that's okay. I wanted everyone to be here for this." Everyone. The word hung in the air between them. And Emma continued, her excitement palpable. "You finally get to meet my half-siblings. Can you believe it? Half-siblings." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He looked at the four young adults at the table, really seeing them for the first time. Two young men and two young women, all with varying shades of dark hair and features that struck him as hauntingly familiar. "Nice to finally meet you, Michael," said one of the young men, standing to offer his hand. "I'm Jason. I've heard a lot about you from Emma." Michael shook his hand, automatically his mind racing. Jason appeared to be the oldest of the four, perhaps 25 or 26. His handshake was firm, confident. His eyes, Michael's stomach lurched, with the exact shade of green as his own. "And I'm Megan," said one of the young women, also standing. She had Catherine's smile, but her nose and chin. Michael felt suddenly dizzy. They were unmistakably like his own. "Emma's told us so much about her dad. This is Daniel," Emma said, pointing to the other young man, who gave a casual wave. "And Sophie," the youngest girl, who couldn't be more than 21, smiled shyly. Michael stood, rooted to the spot, unable to process what he was seeing. These young adults, all born after his divorce, bore striking resemblances not just to Catherine, but to him. The shape of Jason's jaw, the way Daniel's eyebrows furrowed when he smiled, Megan's distinctive nose, Sophie's eyes, the same unusual hazel as his mother's had been. But it was impossible. Catherine had been diagnosed with premature ovarian failure when they were still married. The doctors had been definitive. She would never conceive naturally. It was why their multiple rounds of IVF had failed. It was why, after 8 years of marriage and tens of thousands of dollars spent on fertility treatments, they'd started to discuss adoption, discussions that quickly devolved into bitter arguments about their future. It was why, when Catherine had accused him of not truly wanting children if they weren't biologically his, he'd exploded with the accumulated frustration of years of disappointment. It was why she'd left him, claiming he'd never really loved her, only the idea of what she could give him. And now, 19 years later, here she sat surrounded by 4 young adults who looked like they could be his children. "Michael." Catherine's voice cut through his thoughts. She'd stood up and was now just a few feet away from him. "It's been a long time." The restaurant seemed to tilt around him. The noise of other diners faded to a dull roar in his ears. Robert, Catherine's husband, he presumed, watched the exchange with casual interest, seemingly unbothered by Michael's obvious distress. "Catherine," Michael finally managed, his voice barely audible. When did you—" He gestured weakly toward the 4 young adults, unable to formulate a coherent question. "Perhaps we should sit down," Catherine suggested, her tone maddeningly calm. Emma's celebration shouldn't be overshadowed by ancient history. Ancient history, as if the life they'd shared, the dreams they'd built and watched crumble, could be dismissed so easily. As if the children they desperately wanted together weren't sitting right there, somehow existing despite medical impossibility. Michael allowed himself to be guided to a chair between Emma and Jason. The waiter appeared with menus, chattering about specials that Michael couldn't comprehend. His eyes kept darting between the 4 young faces across from him, cataloging features, making mental comparisons. "So, Michael," Roberts said, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "Emma tells us you're still with the engineering firm. How's that going?" Small talk. They were making small talk as if this were a normal family dinner, as if Michael's world hadn't just imploded. He gave some automatic response about recent projects and retirement plans, words that meant nothing flowing from his mouth while his mind screamed questions he couldn't voice. Throughout the appetizers, Michael observed the interactions around him with growing certainty. These were not just Catherine's children with another man. The resemblances were too strong, the timing too suspicious. But how? They'd stored embryos at the fertility clinic. Embryos created from his sperm and Catherine's eggs before her condition worsened. But those had been used in their failed IVF attempts. There shouldn't have been any left. Unless there were. The realization hit him with such force that he nearly dropped his wine glass. Catherine had stolen their embryos. After the divorce, she must have used them without his knowledge or consent. "Dad," Emma's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Are you okay? You look pale." "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just a bit overwhelmed." It's not every day I get to celebrate my daughter's success with everyone. Emma beamed, clearly pleased that her fractured family seemed to be getting along. If only she knew the storm raging inside him. As the main courses arrived, Michael found himself engaging more, asking careful questions of the four young adults. Jason was completing his residency in cardiology. Megan was an environmental lawyer. Daniel had just started his master's in computer science. Sophie was studying literature at Northwestern. All successful, intelligent, driven, just as he and Catherine had once dreamed their children would be. Catherine, Michael said during a lull in conversation, keeping his voice light despite the tremor that threatened to break through. I'd love to hear how you and Robert met. It must be quite a story. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly, detecting something beneath his casual inquiry. Not particularly dramatic, I'm afraid. Robert was my fertility specialist when I decided to try again after our divorce. The confirmation landed like a blow. Michael's suspicions solidified into certainty. Fertility specialist, he repeated, setting down his fork carefully to hide the shaking of his hands. That must have been challenging work, given your diagnosis. Robert chuckled, oblivious to the tension. Actually, Catherine's case was quite remarkable. With the advancements in reproductive technology at the time and the quality of the preserved embryos, we achieved success rates that exceeded expectations. Preserved embryos. They're embryos. Michael's embryos. Dad pioneered some cutting-edge techniques, Jason added proudly. His work with cryopreserved embryos changed the field. Michael's throat constricted. How fortunate, he managed. Catherine was watching him now, a warning in her eyes. Don't make a scene. Not here. Not during Emma's celebration. But how could he not? 19 years of his life had been built on a lie. He'd mourned the children he thought he'd never have, while Catherine had been raising them without him. The bitterness he thought he'd overcome years ago surged back with renewed force. So, Robert, Michael said, his voice deceptively calm, when did you and Catherine get married? Before or after the first successful pregnancy? Emma shifted uncomfortably beside him. Dad, it's all right, Emma, Catherine interjected. Your father is naturally curious after all this time. Robert and I married when Jason was 2, Michael. We wanted to establish our family before making it official. Our family. Michael felt a surge of rage, so powerful he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. These were his children, his biological children. Yet Catherine spoke as if they belonged solely to her and Robert. How generous of you, Michael said, unable to keep the edge from his voice, to allow Robert to be part of your family. Catherine's eyes flashed. Robert has been more of a father to these children than you could ever have been. Mom, Emma exclaimed, clearly distressed. Dad, please don't do this. I'm sorry, Emma, Michael said, not taking his eyes off Catherine. But there are things that need to be said. Not here, Catherine hissed. Not now. But it was too late. The dam had broken, and 19 years of questions, of grief, of rage came flooding out. Did you ever intend to tell me? Michael asked, his voice low and dangerous. Did you ever think I had a right to know about my own children? A heavy silence fell over the table. The 4 young adults exchanged confused glances. What is he talking about, Mom? Megan asked, her brow furrowed. Catherine's face had drained of color. Michael, stop this. You're ruining Emma's celebration. I think you ruined something far more important a long time ago, Michael replied. He turned to the 4 bewildered young adults. Has your mother ever told you about the embryos we created together during our marriage? The ones that somehow became all of you after our divorce? Michael, Catherine's voice was sharp with panic. This is not the time or place. But Michael couldn't stop now. Did she tell you that I never knew you existed? That she took what was partly mine and created lives I never got to be part of? Robert placed a restraining hand on Catherine's arm as she began to rise from her seat. Perhaps we should continue this discussion elsewhere, he suggested, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. No, Michael said firmly. I've waited 19 years for answers. I think I've been patient enough. Emma was crying now, her celebration thoroughly derailed. Dad, please, she begged. Whatever this is, can it wait? Michael looked at his daughter, his only acknowledged child, and felt a stab of remorse. But the truth that had been hidden for so long couldn't be contained any longer. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said softly, "but your mother took something from us, that can never be returned. She took the chance for you to grow up with siblings you knew. She took my right to be a father to my own children." Jason stood abruptly, his face pale. "What exactly are you saying?" Michael met his gaze steadily. "I'm saying that the embryos that became you and your siblings were created during my marriage to your mother, using my genetic material. I'm saying that, biologically, I am your father, not Robert." The chaos that erupted at the table was immediate. Sophie burst into tears. Daniel stared at his mother in shocked disbelief. Megan began firing questions at Robert, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Jason remained standing, his eyes locked on Michael's face as if seeing it for the first time. "Is this true?" he demanded, turning to Catherine. "Is he our biological father?" Catherine's composure finally shattered. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But Robert raised you. Robert has been your father in every way that matters." "Except you never gave me the choice," Michael said, the anger in his voice giving way to profound sadness. "You never gave any of us the choice. You didn't want children unless they were biologically yours." Catherine shot back, years of justification evident in her tone. "When we discussed adoption, you balked. You made it clear biology mattered to you." "That's not fair, and you know it," Michael countered. "I was processing grief over the family we thought we couldn't have. I needed time, not abandonment." "And what about my grief?" Catherine demanded. "You think it was easy for me to accept I couldn't conceive, naturally? That my body had failed? You weren't the only one suffering, Michael." The restaurant had grown quiet around them, other diners casting curious or concerned glances their way. Emma had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "So you stole our embryos," Michael said flatly. "You created lives from them and never told me." "I didn't steal anything," Catherine insisted. "Those embryos were as much mine as yours. And after what you said, after you made it clear you couldn't love an adopted child the same way, what was I supposed to do? Let those embryos, my last chance at motherhood, go to waste? You were supposed to tell me." Michael's voice rose despite his efforts to control it. "You were supposed to give me the chance to be their father." Robert finally spoke up, his professional demeanor completely abandoned. Catherine made the decision she thought was best at the time. "I supported her because I loved her, and I've loved these children as my own from the moment they were born." "How convenient for both of you," Michael said bitterly. "And how devastating for me. Did you ever try to find us?" Jason asked suddenly. "After the divorce, did you ever look for Mom?" The question caught Michael off guard. "I know. Catherine made it clear she wanted nothing to do with me. The divorce was ugly. By the time the dust settled, she had moved away. I knew she was remarried, but nothing else." "So you just gave up," Jason said, an accusation in his tone. "You didn't fight for her, or for us." "I didn't know about you," Michael protested. "How could I fight for something I didn't know existed?" "But you could have fought for Mom," Jason persisted. "You could have tried harder to make the marriage work." Michael felt the unfairness of the accusation like a physical pain. "Your mother left me," he said quietly. "She filed for divorce. She moved across the country. What was I supposed to do? Force her to stay in a marriage she didn't want?" Catherine had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Jason, the divorce wasn't that simple. There were complexities you don't understand." "Then help us understand," Megan interjected, her lawyer's mind clearly working to piece together the fragments of truth being revealed. "If these embryos existed, and you knew about them, Dad," she faltered, looking between Robert and Michael. "Robert, why didn't you question the ethics of using them without the biological father's consent?" Robert shifted in his seat. The paperwork Catherine provided indicated she had full rights to the embryos. "By the time I became involved personally rather than professionally, the first pregnancy was already established." "Paperwork I never signed," Michael said flatly. "Paperwork that must have been forged." The accusation hung in the air between them. Catherine didn't deny it. "I did what I had to do," she said finally. I don't expect any of you to understand, but at the time, it felt like my only option. Your only option was to commit fraud? Michael asked incredulously. To deny me my children? To deny them a father who would have loved them from the start? You weren't ready to be a father. Catherine exploded. You proved that when you couldn't handle the idea of adoption. You proved that when you threw yourself into work instead of dealing with our grief together. You proved that when you chose your career over our marriage. That's not what happened, and you know it, Michael countered, old wounds reopening. I was working extra hours to pay for the fertility treatments you insisted we continue, long after the doctors said they were futile. I was trying to build security for the family we both wanted. And as for adoption, I never said no. I said I needed time to adjust to the idea. You were the one who couldn't wait. Emma suddenly stood up, tears streaming down her face. Stop it. Both of you, just stop. She looked between her parents, decades of hurt evident in her expression. Do you have any idea what it was like growing up with this? The silences? The tension whenever I mention one of you to the other? And now I find out I have siblings I never knew about? That my own mother kept this secret from everyone. She turned to Michael, her voice breaking. And you just gave up. You let Mom take me across the country and only saw me during scheduled visits. Do you know how many times I waited for you to fight harder to be in my life? Michael felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. Emma, I never thought. Your mother had primary custody. I tried to be there as much as I could. Not enough, Emma said simply. Neither of you tried hard enough. With that, she grabbed her purse and fled the restaurant, leaving a devastated silence in her wake. Michael stared after her, torn between following his daughter and continuing this long-overdue confrontation with Catherine. Before he could decide, Sophie spoke up, her voice small but steady. I always felt something was missing, she said, looking directly at Michael. I used to have these dreams about another father, not Robert, someone else, watching over me. Mom always dismissed them, said it was just my imagination. She paused, tears filling her eyes. But it wasn't, was it? It was some part of me that knew. Michael felt his throat constrict with emotion. I don't know, Sophie, but I would have been there if I'd known. For all of you. You can't know that, Catherine said sharply. You can't rewrite history to make yourself the hero, Michael. You weren't ready then. And you didn't give me the chance to get ready, he replied. You made a unilateral decision that affected all of us, and now you're trying to justify it by claiming you knew what was best. The tension at the table was palpable. Daniel, who had remained largely silent, finally spoke. I need some air, he announced, standing abruptly. This is too much. I'll come with you, Megan said, also rising. She looked between Catherine and Michael, her expression unreadable. I think we all need time to process this. Jason hesitated, then stood as well. Sophie, the youngest, nodded and joined her siblings. The four of them moved toward the exit, leaving Michael, Catherine, and Robert at the table. You should go after Emma, Catherine said to Michael once the others had left. She needs you. They all needed me, Michael replied, his voice hollow. For 19 years, they all needed me, and you made sure I wasn't there. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion Michael had seen from her all evening. I did what I thought was right at the time, she whispered. I was hurt and angry and afraid. And now? Michael asked. Now that they know, what happens? Catherine looked to Robert, who had remained remarkably composed despite having his paternal role questioned so publicly. I don't know, she admitted. This isn't how I wanted them to find out. So you did intend to tell them someday? Michael couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. Yes, Catherine said quietly. When they were older, when they could understand the complexities of the situation. They're adults now, Michael pointed out. Jason is nearly 26, isn't he? How much older do they need to be? Catherine had no answer for that. Robert cleared his throat. Perhaps we should respect their need for space right now. This has been a shock for everyone. Michael laughed humorlessly. A shock you've had 19 years to prepare for. A shock I've had 30 minutes to absorb. He stood, throwing his napkin onto the table. I'm going to find Emma, and then I'm going to find my other children, because that's what they are, Catherine, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. They're my children too. Michael, Catherine called as he turned to leave. What are you planning to do? He paused, looking back at the woman he had once loved more than anything in the world. "I'm going to do what I should have done 19 years ago," he said simply. "I'm going to fight for my family." Outside, the autumn air had grown colder, carrying the scent of impending rain. Michael spotted Emma sitting alone on a bench half a block from the restaurant, her shoulders hunched against the chill. He approached slowly, giving her time to notice him, to reject his presence if she wanted to. She didn't look up as he sat beside her, but she didn't move away either. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment of silence. "Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating you, and instead, it turned into a Jerry Springer episode." Emma finished, her voice thick with tears. "Did you know? Before tonight, did you suspect anything?" Michael shook his head. "No. Your mother told me she was infertile. The doctors confirmed it. The idea that she could have children after our divorce never crossed my mind." Emma nodded slowly. "I always wondered why she was so evasive about their father, about Robert's role in their conception. She would change the subject or give vague answers." She turned to look at Michael, her eyes red-rimmed. "They look like you know. I noticed it the first time I met them, but I thought it was my imagination. Jason has your laugh. Daniel has your hands. Megan argues exactly like you do." Michael felt tears prick at his eyes. "I miss so much," he whispered. "Their first steps, first words, first days of school, all of it. Mom will never admit she was wrong," Emma said, wiping her eyes. "She spent too many years convincing herself she did the right thing." "I know," Michael replied, "but that doesn't change what happens now." Emma looked at him curiously. "What has happened now?" Before Michael could answer, a voice called out from down the sidewalk. "Emma? Mr. Reeves?" They turned to see Jason approaching, the other 3 siblings trailing behind him. Their expressions were a mixture of confusion, anger, and curiosity. "We thought we might find you here," Jason said as they reached the bench. He looked directly at Michael, his green eyes, so like Michael's own, assessing. "We have questions." Michael nodded, standing to face them properly. "I imagine you do, and I'll answer anything I can." "Did you really not know about us?" Megan asked, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. "I had no idea," Michael confirmed. "If I had known, nothing would have kept me from being part of your lives." "Mom said you didn't want children unless they were biologically yours," Daniel said, his tone accusatory. "She said that's why you couldn't agree on adoption." Michael sighed heavily. "That's not accurate. Your mother and I were both grieving the loss of the family we thought we'd have. Adoption was something we had just started to discuss when everything fell apart. I needed time to adjust to the idea, time your mother wasn't willing to give me. But these embryos," Sophie said quietly, "they were created when you were still married?" "Yes," Michael confirmed. "We underwent several rounds of IVF before your mother was diagnosed with premature ovarian failure. We had embryos stored at the fertility clinic, but I was told they had all been used in our unsuccessful attempts. Clearly, that wasn't the case." The 4 siblings exchanged glances, a lifetime of assumptions being reevaluated in real time. "So Robert isn't," Jason began, unable to finish the sentence. "Biologically, no," Michael said gently. "But he raised you. He's been your father in all the ways that matter day to day." "Except he knew," Megan said, her voice hard. "He knew we weren't biologically his, and he knew Mom hadn't gotten proper consent to use those embryos. He was complicit in this lie." Michael chose his words carefully. "I don't know exactly what Robert knew or when he knew it. That's something you'll need to discuss with him and your mother." "And what do you want from us now?" Daniel asked bluntly. "Now that you know we exist?" It was the question Michael had been asking himself since the moment of realization. What did he want? What could he reasonably expect after 19 years of absence, regardless of whether that absence was his choice? "I don't expect anything," he said finally. "I would like the opportunity to get to know you, all of you, if you're willing. But I understand if you need time, or if you decide you don't want a relationship with me at all." "And if we do?" Sophie asked, hope evident in her voice despite the circumstances. "If we want to know you." Michael felt a surge of emotion, so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "Then I will be here," he promised. "For whatever you need, whenever you need it, for as long as you'll have me." Emma, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly stood and moved to stand beside Michael. "Dad's a good man," she told her half-siblings. "He's not perfect. God knows neither of our parents is perfect, but he's worth knowing." The endorsement, coming from the one person who had experienced both Catherine and Michael as parents, seemed to carry weight with the four young adults. "I think," Jason said after a moment, speaking for the group as the eldest often does, "that we need time to process all of this, to talk to Mom and Robert, to figure out what this means for our family." "Of course," Michael agreed, trying to hide his disappointment. "Take all the time you need." "But," Jason continued, "I'd like your number, so we can reach you when we're ready to talk more." Michael fumbled for his wallet, extracting a business card with trembling fingers. "My cell is on there," he said, handing it to Jason. "Day or night, whenever you want to talk." Jason nodded, pocketing the card. "We should probably go find Mom and Robert," he said to his siblings. "They're probably worried." As they turned to leave, Sophie suddenly broke away from the group and approached Michael. Without warning, she threw her arms around him in a brief, fierce hug. "I always knew something was missing," she whispered before pulling away and rejoining her siblings. Michael watched them go, his heart simultaneously breaking and mending in ways he couldn't articulate. Emma slipped her hand into his, a gesture of solidarity he hadn't expected but desperately needed. "They'll come around," she said softly. "They're confused and angry right now, but they're good people. Once the shock wears off, they'll want to know you." "I hope so," Michael replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I've already missed so much." "Then don't miss any more," Emma said simply. "Be here now. Be ready when they reach out." They stood together in silence, watching as the four siblings disappeared back into the restaurant, presumably to confront Catherine and Robert with their newfound knowledge. "What about you?" Michael asked finally, turning to his daughter. "Are you okay? This affects you too." Emma laughed humorlessly. "Finding out I have 4 half-siblings my mother never bothered to mention, that my parents' entire divorce was based on a lie, that my stepfather participated in keeping you from your own children." She shook her head. "No, Dad, I'm not okay, but I will be, eventually." "I'm sorry," Michael said again, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "If I had known—" "But you didn't," Emma interrupted. "And that's on Mom, not you." She sighed heavily. "I'm going to go back to my apartment. I need some time alone to think." "Of course," Michael said, reluctant to let her go, but understanding her need for space. "Can I call you tomorrow?" Emma nodded. "Actually, why don't you come over for breakfast? 9 o'clock. We can talk more when we've both had some sleep." "I'd like that," Michael said, relief washing over him. At least one relationship wasn't completely shattered by the night's revelations. After Emma left in a taxi, Michael found himself alone on the sidewalk, the events of the evening playing on repeat in his mind. The shock of recognition, the dawning realization, the confrontation with Catherine, the brief, heart-wrenching interactions with the children he'd never known he had. He began walking aimlessly, needing to move, to process, to breathe. The city lights blurred through the tears he'd been holding back all evening. 19 years. He'd lost 19 years with his children because of Catherine's deception and his own failure to fight harder for what mattered. But perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps, as Emma suggested, he could still be here now. He could still build relationships with Jason, Megan, Daniel, and Sophie, different from what might have been, but real nonetheless. His phone vibrated in his pocket. With shaking hands, he retrieved it, expecting Emma or perhaps even Catherine. Instead, an unknown number displayed on the screen, along with a text message. "This is Jason. I know we said we needed time, but I have more questions. Can we meet tomorrow? Just you and me." Michael stopped walking, staring at the message as if it might disappear if he looked away. Hope, tentative but undeniable, bloomed in his chest. He quickly typed a response. "Absolutely. Name the time and place, and I'll be there." As he pressed send, Michael felt something shift within him, a weight he'd carried for 19 years without even realizing it beginning to lift. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with emotional landmines and complicated family dynamics. Catherine would likely never admit the full extent of her wrongdoing. Robert's role in the deception would need to be addressed. His relationships with his newly discovered children would take time to develop, if they developed at all. But for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Michael felt something he'd thought long extinguished: the possibility of wholeness. Not the life he'd planned, not the family he'd once envisioned, but something real and precious nonetheless. His phone vibrated again with Jason's response: a time and place for their meeting tomorrow. As Michael read it, the first drops of rain began to fall, cold and cleansing against his upturned face. He didn't seek shelter. Instead, he stood in the growing downpour, letting it wash away the years of unknowing, of loss, of missed opportunities. Tomorrow would bring a new beginning, tentative and fragile, but a beginning nonetheless. Tomorrow, he would start the journey of becoming a father to the children who had been his all along. Tomorrow, he would begin to reclaim what had been taken from him. For tonight, he simply stood in the rain and allowed himself to feel everything: the grief, the rage, the hope, as the city continued around him, indifferent to the small miracle of connection being reborn in its midst.